Are we sharing the slides anywhere from the presentations, or are we just relying on the recording to keep those?
Mm-hmm.
Are we sharing slides anywhere?
Yeah, so if you can share your slides on the agenda document.
Cool. I will make a do that.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and otherwise, we're back. And for the last stretch of this TPAC, let me share my screen and we can get started. Okay. So, I basically wanted to share a rough idea of how we could improve performance metric reporting through the reporting API that came up in various conversations. Basically, our general guidance for web developers and run providers is to use page visibility. And then whenever the page goes to the hidden state, that is a signal for analytics provider to keep state on the page and send any analytics that they may have for the current session, because browsers may terminate that tab or that renderer at any point in time after that hidden after that hidden event or that visibility change event with a hidden state. And events that web developers used to rely on, such as unload, before unload, or page hide, are not guaranteed to actually fire before the renderer disappears. Because in many cases, especially on mobile, by the time that the browser understands that the tab is going to be discarded, it is reluctant to revive that renderer in order to fire that event and then kill it. In many cases, the renderer is already in a state that is not necessarily revivable. The problem with that is that even though that blog post is 5 years old, there are still many cases where this is not what developers are doing. Visibility events are not the intuitive point in which developers think that they should be using in order to send their events up, in order to send their beacons up. Having that kind of session by session reporting, if the user goes back and forth from visible state to hidden and so on, that requires some backend stitching for all those different bits of data to make sure that they are aligned into a single session that developers can then look into. And unfortunately, it is still not a common thing. Many reports are biased towards onload time or some other event that happens rather early in the page loading lifecycle, and that skews many reports in favor of early loading metrics, and it skews the reports of continuous metrics that need to be gathered throughout the lifetime of the page. So I had a bunch of conversation with folks about way to solve this problem, and what I have in mind is trying to tackle the use case of a way to tell the browser the metrics that we want to collect, and then have the browser simply send those metrics over when the tab gets discarded using the reporting API. I also had other conversation with folks that were interested in being able to collect various metrics without ever running scripts on the page. This is not that. Like, this doesn't solve this particular use case. It may or may not be something we want to solve, but this is not what I aimed for here. So a rough sketch of what I had in mind is essentially the developer defines a blob of various metrics and various bits of information that they want to report. They define an endpoint, define some sort of a timeout in case that they don't want the reports to lag too much. And then they can theoretically register that report, declaring the endpoint, the blob, and the timeout. Note that the blob here is still empty. And then later on, they can add metrics to the blob by either going through the performance timeline for marks or whatever other metric reported there, and as well as a performance observer that concatenates entries and adds them to the blob. And the report doesn't get explicitly sent by the developer, but is sent by the browser either when the timeout expires or when the renderer dies. This is not an actual proposal yet. The reason I wanted to talk about this is to figure out whether this is something that would be interesting to y'all, especially folks who gather those metrics, because it seems to me that it would have a few benefits over the way that things need to be done today. It will enable to coalesce metrics from multiple visibility sessions on the client side instead of having to implement server-side session stitching. It seems like it would have slightly better ergonomics than latching onto the visibility events and sending beacons manually. And if this is indeed something that would be interesting from your perspective, will you switch? And if so, how soon? So yeah, I have a bunch of open questions, but maybe we can, if this seems interesting, then please speak up.
Yoav, this is Steven from Salesforce. So I don't think we would be switching to that because today we send a beacon after. So we have a web app. So it's not, I think you call that multi-page app. It's a web app. So we have one session with multiple pages that can last for hours. That can be, hundreds of pages in the same, hundred of soft navigation into the same page. And so we send one payload per page. So when we detect we have some sort of heuristic. And so doing that would mean that we would do that at the end of the session. That might be, hours of data we collected. So that would not work for the way we're doing today. It would be too much of a payload at once.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, so your use case, let me try to restate that. So you have an SPA that where you are aware of transitions between one page to the other and report during those transitions. And what do you do for cases where the user goes away? So do you keep track of visibility state? When do you report?
So yeah, so we have something like we implemented our own version of TTI. And so at some point we know that the page is finished because there's no more XHR in flight, there's no more activity on the thread. And we have, maybe we wait a little bit. I don't exactly know the details, but then we fire the beacon for that page. So the visibility doesn't come into play. We do report if the page was, during that session, if the page was visible, not visible, for us to know if it was, if it was in the background or not. But that's kind of like how we do. So we wait for the page to be done because there's no more activity, and then we wait X second, and then we beacon back the payload.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Someone raised their hand. Michael.
I did. I'm eager to hear from the providers, but I just wanted to follow up with what Stephen said, because it makes sense that for a long-lived single-page application, the page load, or like the page lifecycle, doesn't map well to each thing. So there's like a whole problem around cutting up sessions within a load. But even within one, let's call it route or session or soft nav, I've heard that you want to send up a report early, like either on load or your self-implemented TTI type moment. So even within one session, is it true that you wouldn't want to have a summary at the end of that, however you slice the soft nav or whatever it is? And so is there already an existing problem where you want to send a report very early as soon as like loading is complete, and then there's a problem with stitching later? So just that problem specifically, even if we've solved the how do you slice pages and when to send per session. Because I think with this proposal, you would send as late as possible once you have as much data as possible. But I've previously heard that there's like a part of it you want to send eagerly, and a part of it that you want to send once you have the rest of the data, and there's maybe a backend problem with stitching. Is that true? Anyway, thanks.
The question is for me, Michel, right?
Yeah, Stephen or Nick, or I've heard this from several providers, I think, like analytics. And I don't know, basically, is it just that like, hey, this is a lot of work, we haven't done it yet, or is it something fundamental that could be captured in a reporting API?
So I think I can talk to a little more of our use cases that may help here, but I would like to continue on something that Stephen was saying. And I'm wondering, Stephen, if this type of API would also have a way for you to say, send it now as well, where basically you're just accumulating data into a variable, and either that data will go out when the page unloads, or it'll go out after the timeout, or forcefully when you say it will. Then you kind of get the best of both worlds, where you can accumulate data as long as you want. If you're tracking any continuous data like CLS, for example, over the page's life cycle, and just let the browser take care of it at the unload. But if you do need to force it out because of the single page app transition, you could say, oh, everything that I've queued up to this point, please send it. Let's start over after that, and then continue with something else. Like that's kind of one way that I'm thinking about how this could be very beneficial for analytics. So that kind of brings it back to how this would benefit us for RUM, which is we I mean, this is almost a primary use case for stuff that we need. We are constantly struggling between capturing as much data as we can and sending it out right away, and that we want to send it out right away because of the unreliability issues that we've had in the past with page hide and unload and before unload and all that kind of stuff, as well as kind of like a real-time component that's maybe unique or not to our analytics. versus also collecting not just page load data, right? So not just cumulative layout shift, but you could think of collecting JavaScript errors, other user interactions that you want to track, frame rates, or there's a lot of things that are kind of like continuous data that are happening that you may want to report for your users, especially whether it's around a transition or not, but just things to keep track of on the page. And so we today we send the majority of our data at onload or right around onload, depending on if it's a single page app or not. But there are these things that we want to queue up for later. And if we had the guarantee, if you will, that all of this data would go out at the same time, no matter what, we probably wouldn't send our beacon right at onload. We'd probably wait up to whatever our customers want for real-time data. So if it's kind of like an improvement on top of like even the beacon API, which is like, I want to just keep on piling on the data and then you handle it for me. Like you handle the transport and let me reset it or send it or whatever if I need to. But otherwise, it would be very, very useful for us from a reliability point of view. And I think we would capture more, we would diverge away from being so load focused in our measurements and more towards overall user experience and happiness, which is where we want to go by collecting later things.
So going back to my question, will you use it? And if so, when? Like assuming it ships tomorrow.
Yeah, so I would say we would probably aim to start using it right away, because for customers that want to track this data, it would give them much better data. It would give them a more reliable time to interactive that we track today. We have the same thing with Stephen, where we have kind of like we wait for a little while, but not too long, because we don't want to lose the user experience. All these things that I'd already mentioned are things that would improve on the data reliability and accuracy for our customers. There's always technical challenge to implementing something like this, but it would definitely be something that I could see us trying to utilize right away.
Awesome, thank you. Ian, you're next.
I do just want to say, in response to what you were saying, Nick, that the reporting API is very geared towards coalescing reports when we can and delaying the sending of them, just to respect the user's bandwidth. So I know you mentioned having some kind of API that would let you send it immediately. I think what we would do in that case is actually just have a way to imperatively snapshot the performance data. I just sort of queue that report, and then you can snapshot it 4 or 5 more times, maybe before a single report bundle was to go out.
Yeah, I also think that in the model that I had in mind, you still have the object, so you could still cancel the report and just send beacon it, or
clear the object out and then just send out the data via send beacon API. Yeah, that would be another way to. Yep. If you did need to force data out mid-session because of a page transition, you could do that.
Yeah.
Right. Would it be important to force it out though, like to actually enforce that it gets sent out right then, or still just queue it and send 3 or 4 page transition reports on unload?
Probably for us, because we do have a strong real-time component to our analytics, we would like to guarantee, I don't know what a guarantee would be, but today we deliver data to our dashboards within 5 to 10 seconds. So customers that may want to get more page lifetime data may sacrifice some of that real-timeness to get some of the additional data. So there's probably a balance there that we would have to figure out. But it would either probably be like send it right now or soon, but don't wait 30 minutes, kind of. But I don't know, something in between there, right?
Right. I think we wait up to like a minute right now in some cases. But,
seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Scott.
Yeah, I just wanted to call out. This is really similar to something that's come up when we've been working on task scheduling with some partners, specifically with Airbnb. And what they want to do is it's mostly for analytics, or they're logging, or they tend to batch that stuff. And they want to schedule it in, let's say, an idle task or a background task in post task. But they also want the guarantee that it's eventually going to get sent out. or that task is eventually going to run. So they were, wondering, so what they have to do is track those tasks manually as well as queuing them with the browser, which is less than ideal. And what they were kind of looking for is something like a similar guarantee, like, can we make sure these tasks run on page height or something? So we've even been this kind of was discussed yesterday, like considering whether or not we'd want to add an option to post task such that you can mark that these tasks need to run. And this gives you maybe that best of both worlds where, okay, it'll run if there's nothing else that can run at the time. So it's not going to interfere with, user interactions and whatnot. And we'll make sure it gets run on visibility change or something like that. So definitely seems a lot of overlap. I wonder, do we need something general like that through task scheduling, or maybe this reporting way is a better way to go?
I think that reports, like generally the actual report sending doesn't have to happen on main thread or in the render at all. I don't know where it happens now, but like theoretically that could, but I guess the bit that could be interesting for the scheduling piece is the metric collection. Yeah, but definitely sounds like, yeah, assuming this is of interest, sounds like, yeah, it would be good to coordinate those efforts.
So isn't a more generic version of this essentially a slightly more advanced send beacon where you could have timeout and the ability to cancel it?
So I think this is different than send beacon in the sense that you provide the blob that you want to send, but it is still empty, and you only fill it up once the metrics come in. So I think that send beacon, the goal is to, like, here is data, you can copy it and send it now, and it should survive render termination, but it shouldn't wait for render termination. And this is a different thing in the sense that you can, like, it's like Nick said, it gives you data reliability that your renderer won't die on you without sending data, or at least to, a large extent.
Right, but I guess that's the original intention of send beacon. What I mean is that this, like, you can make this even more generic. Like, you want the ability to have some control about the timeout for when this gets sent regardless. You want the guarantee that it's going to get sent no matter what. And you want the ability to update it. This is why it meant that a cancelable send beacon would get close to it.
Yeah, I guess you could think of it as a send beacon with a minimum value and a maximum value for the timeouts.
But yeah. I mean, kind of too, but like, it's also, it's something that you don't want to send right away. Like you're saying, I don't want this data sent until the end. Whereas with send beacon, you're attempting to send it immediately. So it's kind of like, send now versus send at the very end kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I meant with the minimum value. Like, you want to say that don't send it before, the metrics are actually collected. But yeah. Scott?
Or so I can maybe provide another data point. This sounds interesting, especially if the intent here is that it's going to be more reliable than send beacon. At least as we've seen, we also have this notion of sending last minute telemetry data before the session ends, or before the on close, or before unload, or locations like that. And we've seen that send beacon can be unreliable, especially if it reaches a certain threshold of concurrent requests, and the browser starts dropping them using some heuristics. We don't even have control on that. And if this can be like a super send beacon that is always guaranteed, or like, I don't know, very high likely to succeed, then it seems a very attractive option.
Well, what I'm worried about is that it was the original intent of SendBeacon to always work, and then when it actually was implemented, there's a ton of caveats, and it doesn't really work in all situations. So I'm afraid that this will be a repeat of this. Like the intent when it's theoretical is very pure. We want this to always go, and then when you get to actually trying to implement it in various browsers, then you're gonna have a lot of shortcomings to the actual implementation, because originally SendBeacon wanted to do something like this, right?
Yeah, so I think that the fundamental difference here is that this is something you declare ahead of time, and the browser can prepare and copy over the data to somewhere that's safer from the renderer, where SendBeacon is something you call at the very last instance.
Sure.
And in those cases,
but what happens with this if you modify the object at the very last moment? Aren't you going to run into similar situations where that last, like, very late addition to what you want to send is just not going to make it?
Potentially, yeah. And this is definitely something we'd want to look into. Nicholas?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that from my perspective, the main benefit is improving the reliability of sending the performance data. So from the implementation perspective, like we would need to literally store this somewhere in the browser in case the renderer crashes, right? So from that perspective, it's quite different from any task that the renderer may want to run, or B, any arbitrary data that the renderer may want to send, because we probably don't want to guarantee that storing arbitrary data for any arbitrary renderer. So I think, like, I would say it's different from both of those things. But overall, I do think the idea of improving the reliability is super useful, especially given the current architecture of the analytics providers right now.
I guess also limiting by size can be important, because if what you're sending gets too big, it reduces the likelihood of the request to succeed, even if it happens after the render dies.
Yeah, and yeah, agreed. And browsers die too. So one of the last slide, which is a set of open questions. Like, one of my concerns here is that if the one that's dying is not the renderer but the whole browser, and the browser presumably has a bunch of renderers, all of them say send those reports when we're done, then the browser now needs to potentially send many reports at the same time, which can lead to dropped reports or due to congestion or lack of time to actually send them. Yeah, so this is one thing that we'll definitely need to solve.
Why do the tabs need to send the reports at the same time?
It's just that if I have multiple backgrounded tabs that are still alive and haven't sent their reports, and now the user kills the browser, then all those reports presumably need to be sent because their renderers died, but the browser who's supposed to be doing the sending is also, living on borrowed time.
If some of the earlier concerns around like real time and sending like partial updates earlier, then you might see folks still using visibility change event to do a partial push, and then there might be less data because if that becomes a popular pattern to to start by putting it in here, which is a very lazy send beacon that's, you know, maybe more reliable, maybe not, but it's at least easy to call into with the expectation that it eventually gets delivered. And then you can make a tactical decision about being more eager. You know, you're more confident about making that decision later, and then you cancel the original request. So if that becomes a common pattern, then this might go away.
Yeah, and you don't even have to cancel it. You can just take metrics out of it and put them into a separate beacon that you send right away. But yeah. Stephen?
Yeah, so yeah, that was actually my question. I think if this API allowed a way to say report send now, so you would add your data to that object, and then if you could, when for example there's a soft nav, you could say, okay, send it now, flush the buffer in a way that would be great. Then the rest, you would use that API. That API would be called at the end, when you close the tab and everything. But I think instead of a timeout, it would be great if we could imperatively say, send it now. So in a long session, we could decide when to send it, and then at the end, it would take care of sending the remaining. That would be clean.
Yeah, and then if a timeout is what you really want, you could have a set timeout that does that. And if that never happened, that's fine too. Yeah. Yeah, and then the other question I had in mind is that a very simple form of this is something you can get away without backend stitching, but any time of real-time reporting or intermediate reporting will still require some sort of a stitching. And I'm wondering if that would be a hurdle to adoption or not, if folks have opinions.
For the things that we want to measure beyond the page load beacon that we sent today, I think we can package it up and present it to our visitors in a way that helps them understand that, these are metrics that we're collecting beyond the page load, and you may need to look at 2 individual views to kind of see what happened during page load, and another view to see what happened beyond it, or something like that. I think there's more value in actually being able to reliably collect these metrics than the concern around having to have like the whole thing visible all at once. Or we could do it on demand or what have you. But I don't see it as a big concern for us.
Okay, thanks. Cool. Yeah.
Hey, Yoav.
Yep.
Can you kind of detail or walk through the workflow by what you imply by server-side stitching? Can you define that a little bit more precisely?
Sure. So essentially, when collecting metrics, you have a collection server that receives reports. And if it receives a single report per user session that they want to then present to developers or process and do something with, then they don't need to, basically each report then gets processed and displayed to whoever that report's customer is. But if you get multiple reports per session, so one example is if you're sending reports on visibility state changes, but the user clicks back and forth and you want to include all that in a single session, or if you want to send a report every minute with what happened during that minute, or whatever other strategy of continuous reporting you can think of, then you need at the collecting server or somewhere in the processing pipeline to realize that report A and report D are reports from the same session, the same user, and they need to be stitched together for presentation purposes. Does that make sense?
Could I take a stab at like a more layman's explanation of, because I'd like to wrap my head around this as well in terms of where the problems are. But you know, I'm very interested in metrics after page load, like full page lifecycle, and we've talked about it a few times this week. And so the perfect measure, you don't know what the values are until the very end, like when the page is unloading. Because if you want to track the average interaction cost or the average smoothness or the total amount of layout shift, you need to wait to get all of that data. And this becomes more and more complicated, especially as you have things like BF cache, where the lifetime of the session is like super elongated. And I understand that for like RUM frameworks, they want a very eager report to go out, to show it in the dashboard and to have confidence that it eventually gets delivered. And so now you have a problem where you may have at the very least 2 reports, an eager one and a late one at the very end of the page, or you might even have a trickle effect of like every visibility change, every session navigation, whatever it is. And so what do? Do you overwrite? Do you average? Do you add? And it might be different per metric and depending on what you showed to users later. And so I guess there's a whole backend infrastructure problem that doesn't map to the way it's been built to date. And that's my understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. One other just kind of like aspect from a data point of view that's a concern for us is like let's say you have a data point like a page load time, and then later you have a data point about cumulative layout shift. There's all this metadata that goes with both of those, like what kind of browser was it, where did they come from, what were they doing before, what's their session ID. There's all this metadata for each one of those individual timers. If we can essentially kind of like group that all together in a single row in very simple database terms that has both the timestamp, the 2 timestamps, and then all this metadata, that's way more efficient than having like 10 rows with all the same metadata, but just one different timestamp in each. So it becomes a data processing problem to have data, like individual data points come in a trickling way versus being able to kind of group them together into that single session, because you're going to be, every other view, every other report, every other slicing and dicing of this data is based on the same kind of characteristics except for those individual timestamps. So, you know, that from just an infrastructure point of view, that's why we try to group all of our data kind of and send it through the pipeline at once, if you will.
Cool. So Benjamin, so did all that clarify your question?
And I mean, a lot of this whole like stitching thing is, you know, outside the concern of this API, obviously, but it will help us if we can. I think it'll help a lot of analytics providers, because a lot of us do the same thing, which is we send all our data at once because we don't want to deal with multiple random bits of data coming in at random times. We'd rather it all arrive in one group. We can process it as one. We can push it forward as one. We don't have to like hold on to it and wait for other pieces that we don't know if they're ever going to come or not. It's just easier to process individually.
So how do you envision you using this API in some, well, still maybe accommodating the real-time constraints? An early report and a complete report kind of way,
Yeah.
so you don't have.
Yeah, I could envision us, you know, and completely spitballing here, but I could envision us like classifying different types of metrics as more real time or less real time, right? The more real time ones are like the page load time, because that happens. Whereas you have like other reports that are more kind of like a rolling average of the last, you know, or they come in when they come in. So it could be 5-10 minutes delayed or whatever, just based on the page itself. So I think there's ways as a RUM provider to kind of communicate that and to deal with it. We've chosen not to up to this point, but we certainly should to help with the user experience.
Yeah. Cool.
So I have a broad question, I guess, which is, I do see that this could be appealing as an alternative to the send beacon, just like a lazy send beacon. But we talked this week already a bunch about the potential for like the performance timeline to eventually maybe evolve towards some concept of like slicing across sessions or timelines across soft navs or BF navs and stuff.
Yeah.
And it would seem to me that if this was tied very specifically to just performance timeline, that we might be able to sort of help hook those two together. You might imagine doing the report automatically every time a session, or every time the paid session cuts. And so is the intention to focus very narrowly and match like expectations out of the box, or will it be up to developers like to take both and then have to do it all manually?
I haven't thought about that, but that could be an interesting thing to bake in. So like I basically thought about, timeouts and the renderer dying, but we could define some notion of sessions in which also like those reports get sent, and yeah, it could be something like what Steven talked about, where it's the developer-driven sessions, but could also be browser-driven sessions where ahead of time, the developer can say, okay, send me this report every time that the page goes hidden, or every time that, some navigation-y thing happens. And it will also, maybe we could also bake into frameworks the note. So yeah, every time the history, like the new navigation API triggers a new navigation, this is when those reports get sent, or something along those lines. So I haven't thought about it, but that could be an interesting addition.
Yeah, I suspect you'll always want developers to be able to slice in a more fine-grained manner. But in the case that we all rally around at least like some macro notion, it would be perhaps, and I could see wanting to be more eager and slice it, do the default, and then also potentially extend it to really the full like page lifecycle.
Yeah.
Or like the unload or render or dying.
Yeah. And then the major open question, I think, is this one. Can we, like, currently we already have multiple ways to send reports, and will we be able to unite behind this as the one true way, or will this be just, n+1? But I guess that is a question that only time will tell. But it's, I'm happy to hear there's interest. So
I really appreciate you thinking through this and sharing these thoughts. It definitely kind of gets the gears running in my mind of how we could use it better for us.
So do you mean having something like a standardized report format, and you just declare these are the metrics I'm interested in? Please send them to that URL when there's a new navigation?
So I think this is this use case.
Mm-hmm. Well,
which is something
yes,
else.
No, I mean, your script could be just like an observe call where you're saying like observe and report kind of, and declare which fields you want to get. Or it could be through header, lots of options. But I'm thinking of like this trend of new APIs like network error logging, where this is all done automatically for you and you don't get to pick the format, right? So of course there's too much data by default in the performance timeline, even for one person. But it's something to think about probably.
Yeah, this is why I think you need client-side JavaScript to reorder the data in ways that your backend expects. And predefined report format is like, it seems like something else than what I had in mind here. Okay. Cool. Any other questions, thoughts? Cool. So I guess with that, thank you for the great feedback on this one. And we are out of agenda. We kept 30 minutes for overflow time, but it seems like we were right on time throughout the full 4 days, which is unprecedented. I don't know how that happened. So
we generated 48 pages of words.
48.
It was perfect organization. That's why.
So
Oh,
yes,
I was going to say, so that's it. The web is fixed and everything is fine, so we don't need to work anymore.
Well done.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I suspect that's not the case, but yeah, thanks everyone for great 4 days of sessions. I hope you're sticking around the virtual TPAC for next week's breakout sessions. And yeah, I suspect that unlike last year when we planned the in-person interim and then it faded out, I suspect that this year we will try to organize some sort of a virtual interim because 1 year is too long. So staying tuned regarding that. But yeah, thanks all for great 4 days. And I will see you on the calls.
Thank you, everyone. That's great.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye,
Thank you.
guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good week.